Reporters from the Howard Center for Investigative Journalism have been looking into a lithium mine in Silver Peak, Nevada, trying to determine the impact it has on underground water sources in Arizona and other states. For more on their findings, we welcome members of the Howard Center's reporting team, Executive Director Mark Greenblatt, California reporter Daisy Tanner, and Nevada reporter and drone pilot John Leos. Welcome to all of you. Thanks for being here. Mark, when it comes to a huge project like this, what goes into, there are a lot of stories and a lot of things that deserve digging. How long does it take to decide on this project, and how is it decided?
Well, Steve, it really comes down to what kinds of investigative projects can we actually teach investigative journalism through. And at the Howard Center for Investigative Journalism at Arizona State, it's really one of the more unique spaces in higher education, in that what we're aiming to do is not only teach investigative reporting, teach fairness, teach accuracy concepts, but we want to be able to have a story that is so original and so important that it also meets the standards of major national news organizations who we're regularly partnering with.
Okay, so considering all of that, this was done in the Western region, but it didn't necessarily have to?
Well, it didn't have to be. We could be global, we can be anywhere in the country, but we focused in the Western region. We do like to play to our strengths, and we're located out here. And when we found that there was a problem, that we found that there was a problem with lithium, and we all love lithium because it helps us do a lot of great things, but there was this dark side that just didn't have enough light put on it, and it also needed a lot of hard work, a lot of bodies. And so we happened to have a lot of students who wanted to learn, and so we set them loose on digging through literally tens of thousands of regulatory documents until they found quite an important story.
Daisy, that sounds like a lot of fun, digging through a bunch of regulatory documents. What was your specific assignment?
So there weren't really specific assignments. It was more so let loose and see what you find, right? And so I started to look into California. There in California, there were 3 proposed projects, 2 of which actually had regulatory documents that I started to dig into. And from there, I started to find some pretty concerning numbers when it came to water usage, specifically water they were going to use from the Colorado River. So
John, drone, how does that work? And was that your specific assignment? And how did you get that specific assignment?
Yeah, my role on the team was to serve as the lead videographer and kind of visuals reporter. And we knew when we were covering the story that we were going to be going to these kind of vast landscapes and covering these large scale operations and problems. And we needed to see that visually. And so I took the initiative over the course of the semester that we were working on this to get my drone pilot's license, which required studying FAA regulations and practicing in order to capture kind of those grand scenes.
I have to ask the two of you before we go back to Mark. Did you guys envision yourselves being investigative reporters or just journalists? Daisy, let me start with you.
Gosh, I started in broadcast journalism, knew that I loved journalism and wanted to be somewhere in there, but I really developed a deep love, especially through this class, of finding a full story and reporting it all the way through, getting to really dig to the bottom of something that seems different on the top than it is. Once you get to the bottom of the story, you dig through all the regulatory paperwork. So after this, I'm definitely investigative is for me.
And John, how about you?
I started off as a documentary filmmaker and photojournalist, and I never worked on an investigative project before this. I am very interested in environmental topics, and so this project really drew my attention. And yeah, I think the Howard Center really taught me all those investigative skills, and I think they really apply to kind of the visual field.
And Mark, we're learning obviously that the Howard Center has a far reach and a big impact that it can have. When you think about why you came here, how was this to start off as your first major project?
Well, look, I spent more than a decade in Washington, D.C. working for a big company called Scripps, doing national investigations for them. And I came here because I wanted to truly lead the next generation of investigative journalists. And I think you and I are probably going to be working for these two one day. They're really that good. But the concept of being a part of a project that really discovers that, it changes the conversation nationally about how how lithium is actually contributing, how it's drying up parts of our groundwater supplies, how it's taking from the Colorado River, which is already strained. The concept of being able to teach students to be able to do that and to be able to actually ask hard questions of even very large companies, this is a unique thing. I'm very proud of these students.
Well, and you and I are a little bit probably from sort of at least a few years later than the All the President's Men sort of period, but that was something that really had driven young people to want to do more when it comes to investigative journalism. Maybe not take down a president, but in terms of that sort of thing, how does that feel to be, I mean, was that too old a reference, or is that something that students can have a more modern version of that, to think, here's a real impact I can make in my community that can really have important, long-reaching impact?
We talk about All the President's Men, and there's a scene in there where we showed it in class when we were going through this whole thing, where there's a scene where both Woodward and Bernstein are in the Library of Congress going through one methodical card after the next, and you see how much work they have to put in to find something important. And we talked about that as an analogy to the work that these students did here on this very project. There are modern day analogies to that, but the other thing we're doing is we really are trying to take a very modern face to train these students to be future ready. And that means that not only are they having to put out really strong, compelling written material that can meet the standards and land on the front page of USA Today, which this story did, but to also put together a video project that met the standards of the PBS NewsHour and really went in depth on that.
Yeah. So Daisy, sort of briefly on this one, but what was the most intriguing or revelatory thing you found out specifically with what you were investigating?
One of the most revelatory things that the team and I discovered in California was definitely, reading all these regulatory papers. They don't say it in plain language that I typically understand or you would understand, right? So once we realized that an acre-foot of water didn't really mean anything to me, I had to break it down. And once you realize that an acre-foot of water is a foot of water that covers a whole acre, that's a lot more water. We ended up finding that one of the projects in California will be using over 100 billion gallons of water in its lifetime. And that finding alone was just shocking, truly.
And John, finish us off. Briefly, what was the most impactful thing that you found?
Sure. So we took a look at the first operating lithium mine in the United States, which is in Silver Peak, Nevada. And through our on-the-ground reporting and through the research that myself and the fellow reporters had done, had discovered that the pumping of groundwater in this valley in Nevada was really having an impact on the water levels in the surrounding monitoring wells. We went out with a scientist who monitors ground wells annually, and standing around and watching him throw a rock down a well and hearing it clang down to an empty bottom, and he told us that just years earlier there you would have heard a splash as it hit. Over 30 feet of water that had dropped down to nothing. Was really amazing to see in person.
Okay, we'll have to stop there. Thanks to all of you. Congratulations and good luck.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.